Welcome everyone to today's lecture entitled A New Treaty on Pandemics, What is it for and do we need it? By Professor Gian Burci. Our moderator for this session is Dr. Nilofer Oral, Director of the NUS Center for International Law, who will now introduce Professor Burci. Dr. Oral, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sandra, and greetings to everyone and to our participants. Welcome back, and to those joining us from the general public. It's wonderful. We thank you for joining us because both Patricia and I are particularly pleased and honored to have really one of the world's foremost experts on global health law, Professor Gianluca Burci, who will be speaking today on a very interesting topic, a very timely topic, and I'm sure one that he is very directly involved in, and that is a new treaty on the pandemics. What is it for, and do we really need one? But let me give you just a brief summary of his background. There's much more, but just to save time, Professor Burci is adjunct professor of international law at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva since 2012. He is also the director of the joint LLM on Global Health Law and Governance between the Graduate Institute and Georgetown Law School. He's the academic advisor in the Global Health Center of the Graduate Institute. He's also been a visiting professor and senior scholar at the very well-known O'Neill Center on National and Global Health Law in Georgetown University School of Law. But I should say that before this, Professor Burci was legal counsel for the World Health Organization between 2005 and 2016. And he has been involved in the negotiation and implementation of some of the instruments that Dr. Berman has been lecturing the last 2 days, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the revision and implementation of the international health regulations, the WHO's response to the influenza pandemic, the Ebola outbreak, and institutional aspects of WHO reform. So as you see, it is not an overstatement at all to say that he is really one of the global experts on this topic. And we are very eager to hear you today, Gianluca, and I turn the floor over to you for your lecture.
Thank you very much, Nilofer. Thank you for inviting me again. It is a pleasure to be speaking at your academy. As I said, on your mailing list, you have an amazing program, and I'm very happy that it's been successful as it deserves. As you can see, I'm in my living room. We are not in lockdown, but Europe doesn't look very good, and so we are encouraged to work from home as much as possible. So I will be speaking about something that is keeping the diplomatic community in Geneva very excited, very agitated these days. And so that is the proposal for a new treaty on pandemics. Sorry. And this will culminate in a special session of the World Health Assembly, which is a plenary body of WHO that will meet from Monday to Wednesday next week. So we are really at the eve of the Health Assembly. And I will give you some details of what it's about, what do we expect to come out of this special session. This is just the second special session since the onset of WHO in 1948. So you can see the political importance given to this topic. So I understand that Dr. Berman has already talked to you about the international health regulation, which is important because part of the political and academic discourse are also about why do we need a treaty when we have the international health regulations. And I hope you had a chance to browse the document that I assigned as a reading. That's the final report of the working group that has been appointed by the Health Assembly in May to prepare the ground for what will happen next week. So that gives you a bit of a snapshot, both in terms of substance and most importantly, in terms of the politics around this issue. So let me start by reminding you, but I don't need to be, I don't think anybody needs to be reminded of the magnitude of what COVID-19 pandemic demonstrates, because it demonstrates, I think, a systemic failure, both at the upstream, so in the inability of the international community to prevent this kind of catastrophe, and downstream in its consequences on human lives, on basically the enjoyment of human rights. I just come back from a workshop in Italy about human rights principles in public health emergencies, and there is really a sense of outrage, not only in the academic community, but also in many activist NGOs that sees this as almost as a betrayal of trust, in particular by democratic countries. So this is something that is precipitated by a health issue, by a pathogen, but it goes way beyond the domain of health. And that's part of the complexity of the discourse that is taking place now. As you do, so apologies, what it always happens when you have a crisis of this dimension, there has been no shortage of reviews and soul searching and exercises that have come out with findings, with conclusions, and with a lot of recommendations, both at a policy-making level and an academic level. Let me just recall the independent panel on pandemic preparedness and response that was convened by the WHO Director General and chaired by the former President of Liberia, Ellen Sirleaf-Johnson, and the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Ellen Clark. We had a global preparedness monitoring board that has been following events way before the pandemic. The Director General convened a review committee to look at the performance of the international health regulations, the G7, the G20, political networks, international organizations have all looking at the causes and the effect of the pandemic. And as usual in these cases, you have perspective, very, very different perspectives, both on the causes and what do we have to do. But if you look at them, I think they converge around a few main topics. The first is a need for better governance, both in terms of strengthening WHO, that remains at the center of the action. Thank God there is no proposal, as there was to a certain extent after Ebola, to sideline the WHO, but also, as it's often the temptation when there is a new crisis, to create new bodies. Proposal for a Global Health Threat Council, Global Health Threats Board, for new funds, and so on. The second, if you look through this proposal, is the question of power and control, which is inevitable in this case. And here what is striking is the strength and the influence of political networks, in particular the G7 and the G20, vis-a-vis the influence of global organizations that should be theoretically more democratic because more representative, like the UN and WHO. There is clearly a concentration of power in the hands of a number of political networks that try in a way to push the way the world should adapt or should prepare. The third is financing. There's clearly huge financing issues, both of financing global public good, to use a very popular term in public health, but also better financing on national preparedness, both in developing countries, but also in developed countries, because the health system of many developed countries failed much worse, at least last year, than many low and middle income countries. The fourth is a question of equity. COVID has been a multiplier and an amplifier of inequities and inequalities. So the question of not rebuilding, but certainly restructuring our global village on the basis of new rules and new principle of equity is very dominant and is very takes center stage in the political debate. The next is in a way consequential on the previous one, and is the balancing of public authority and private rights and private entitlements. And here the dominance of the pharmaceutical companies, or what has been happening since last year, is very striking. Countries that dumped billions of dollars with almost no questions asked in the coffers of Moderna, of Pfizer, or Johnson & Johnson, with very little demands in return. So you can see really, in my view, an imbalance between public versus private. And then finally, and that takes me to my main argument, there is a perceived and I think very shared need for legal rules. Political frameworks are important, economic arrangements are important, but there really is a feeling that the the magnitude and the global dimension of what happened requires, to a certain extent, an improvement of existing rules and the creation of rules, binding rules, that really create a high level of enforceable political commitment. And that takes me to the main topic of my talk, which is a proposal for a new pandemic treaty. Where does it come from? It came from largely a European initiative. The engine behind this at the beginning has been the European Council, the president of the European Council in particular, Charles Michel. There has been like a sales agent of this idea since November 2020. He converted very quickly the Director General of WHO, Dr. Tedros, to become one of the strongest advocates about the need for a new treaty. And that has landed squarely in the WHO governance, because the direction of this proposal has immediately gone towards WHO. There have been some voices, and I'll explain why, that WHO may be not the best organization, given how broad the topics for possible regulations are that go beyond the classical mandate of WHO, and they've been pointing, for example, to the United Nations. But for a number of reasons, I think this proposal had converged immediately towards WHO. Again, they landed in the Health Assembly in May. There was no consensus. Some of the main holdouts, and I'll say a few words in a moment, are rather powerful countries like the United States, Brazil, Russia, China to a certain extent. And so the compromise was to create a working group, the working group that I mentioned before, that will have to report to the Health Assembly. The world is watching, and so failure is not an option. So what we'll see, and I'm following to the extent I can, the discussions in the diplomatic community, will be launching a new process to negotiate something. It's not clear whether the mandate will be so tight to negotiate a new treaty, because again, the United States is holding out, and so a compromise that is still not resolved 3 days before the start of the assembly will be basically to task this new intergovernmental negotiating body with the negotiation of an instrument, of a convention, agreement, or other instruments, which will be unfortunate because it will postpone these fights to what instead should be a very focused negotiating exercise. But such is the need for political compromise. So the political dynamics have been interesting because on the one hand, you have a rather compact Western European front, largely the European Union. And people have been asking why the Europeans have been so pushy. And on the one hand, in my view, there is a geopolitical interest because a lot of the action last year had been in a way skewed by the bad relationship between China and the United States, so that the governance vacuum that has created to a certain extent. And so I think the Europeans see it as a very good opportunity to occupy that space, to really make the European Union very relevant in global geopolitics. There are other sort of reasons. Obviously, sometimes the real motives, the real reasons behind are not revealed for obvious reasons. And there's some suspicion, frankly, on the intentions of the Europeans, in particular because they've been very, very hard on the question of intellectual property, of relaxing market rules to improve the possibility of developing new vaccine, new countermeasures in developing countries. So some people say it's a way to take center stage, but kick the can down the road when it comes to real painful measures that touch the economic interests of big companies. So there is a certain level of mistrust, and that is in a way polarized the political atmosphere. One would imagine the world coming together and marching in locksteps in response to something of the magnitude of COVID. It's not the case. There have been quite some divisions. And many low and middle income countries are clearly positioning themselves around the question of equity. We will not engage in a new exercise that can be seen as a neo-colonial exercise in disguise, if we don't have clear guarantees that there will be a change in the rules of the game when it comes to, in particular, access to vaccine, access to financing, and so on. So the political landscape is quite fluid. I thought I would mention it at the beginning because many of you, I'm sure, are diplomats, a person that work in the policy space. So these are considerations that resonate with you professionally. So what are some of the, if you look at the current debate, and obviously there's a lot of dust in the air, there's a lot of posturing or tactical positions and so on. What are some of the main questions that have been asked, that have been discussed? The first is, as the title of my talk says, why do we need a treaty? Why this push for new rules? What about the existing rules, soft and hard? The second is consequential on the first. What about the law that we have on the shelves? First and foremost, the international health regulation that in the early stages of the proposal were somehow criticized, I think sometimes tactically, because it's difficult to market a new treaty if you don't put down the international health regulation. Part of the rationale is that the IHR are weak and ineffective, and so that's why we need a treaty. And I'm very relieved that many countries have gone past that and they say, we may need a treaty, but we need to strengthen what we have. That's a very strong position from Brazil in particular. They say we have a lot of law on the shelf in WHO and outside WHO. And so it's short-sighted to somehow brush it aside and just agonize on a new instrument in isolation. And the third is, what is the content? What is the added value? What is the main rationale for a treaty? Here too, I must say the European Union and a growing group that has sent a letter to the British Medical Journal a few days ago, and we are counting 32 countries, not only in Europe, Costa Rica, Chile, Kenya, a number of countries outside Europe, have not done a terribly good job of building a clear, cogent narrative around the push for a treaty. They sort of converge around the theme of main issues, but sometimes the narrative has not been too convincing. And so, for example, the United States instead, that for a number of reasons is not a favor of rushing to a treaty, has done a better job, in my view, of presenting a, first of all, very detailed proposal on why we should need to strengthen the international health regulation first before building a new boat. And so there's also a question of framing. Framing is very important, I think, in international policy and international lawmaking, because they really shift the discourse in certain directions and they create a path dependency. If something is convincing in the frame of health, it almost automatically gravitates towards WHO and really creates a bit of a path dependency in terms of policy and in terms of the normative outcomes that we can expect. So what are some of the main arguments? First, we have gaps to fill, and that I fundamentally agree, and I'll talk about these gaps in a moment. And these gaps cannot be filled by the international health regulation because, as I'm sure Dr. Berman explained, there is a constraint in the legal basis in the WHO constitution of how far an instrument like the IHR can go. The second is a need to generate and sustain a high-level all-of-government commitment. The feeling, again, that the existing WHO law is too much the sandbox of ministries of health, too technical, it cannot really excite and sustain the commitment of prime minister and president. So it's interesting, a treaty is seen as a tool for political engagement. It generates almost, by definition, a higher level of political engagement that an instrument like the IHR cannot raise. The third, again, is the as I've been saying, is a criticism on the narrowness of the IHR, on the technicality, on the fact that member states are not really at the center of the action. It's a managerial instrument that has delegated a lot of implementation to the WHO Secretariat. May be good, but again, politically, there is a price to pay not to have countries more directly involved. And also has been plagued by a perceived low level of compliance. So that's a big argument. We need something that generates more accountability and pushes towards more compliance. So what are some of the substantive proposals? The first is, again, I would call it upstream, what we call One Health, which is basically mapping and managing the risk of zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic diseases are diseases that jump from animal to humans and back. And there is no doubt that some of the really scary diseases that have been traveling around the world in the last 30 years or so are of animal origin, starting with HIV/AIDS, to influenza, seasonal and pandemic, to SARS, to MERS, to COVID, and so on. So we clearly have a big problem and a resolved problem. Some scientists said an insoluble problem. So then don't let's dream that a treaty can somehow close the door in the interaction between the animal and the human world. But clearly there is a blind spot in international policy making and in international law, and I would agree with that. And so one of the recurring proposals is to address this in a treaty. It's an item of remarkable complexity, so much so that there is an ongoing program in the United Nations system among the WHO, FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, OIE, the Organization on Animal Health, and now also UNEP, the UN Environment Program, because it's really the convergence of human health, animal health, food production, livestock management, wildlife management, and environmental protection. So just by this, you can see the sheer complexity. And now you have several layers of complexity. And so, rightly or wrongly, it is felt that common binding rules can improve the current level of governance. The second is the question of national preparedness, what the IHR defined as core capacities. The fact that national health systems have to be equipped in a way that they can prevent, detect, and control outbreaks of infectious diseases. And here, I think COVID has been a game changer. Because if you look to the main crises of the recent past that really made the headlines and so on, they were all or mostly diseases coming from developing countries. And so they really followed the classical playbook that we follow since the 19th century, that the bad diseases come from poor countries and they affect the security of rich countries. So there is a lot of north-south narrative going on there. And Ebola, for example, in a way played into this playbook. COVID has changed the narrative because even though it arose in China, and we can question whether China can still be considered a low and middle income country, it has become global immediately, and it has devastated the health system of developed countries. I'm Italian, and you will remember very well how the Italian health system, which in my view is quite good, imploded in a matter of weeks. So it really changed many assumptions. And I think that the recurrence of this proposal, that we need not only to give more money and more assistance to low and middle income countries, but we need to revisit the system of healthcare and public health, which sometimes has been too privatized, has been moved away from primary healthcare, from the typical structure that instead would provide a filter to try to absorb these kind of shocks. Instead, like in Italy, the shocks went straight to the hospital, and the hospital were unprepared. So the hospital became super spreading sites instead of being the managers of the disease. The third is transparency, good faith, and the need to improve the system of alert and information sharing. That's what, as you could recall, the United States and other countries reproached China for not doing or not doing enough back in January 2020. We need to improve the system of triggering health alert and of more enforceable, transparent system of sharing information, data, alerting, and cooperation. The fourth is empowering WHO. That's a recurring proposal. WHO remains at the center of the action, but in certain respects is seen as an adequately financed organization, constrained by its legal mandate, to, if you want, to match in the blueprint of a typical international organization, very deferential to member states and so on. So one of the proposals, for example, is allowing WHO to put on the web, to send an alert based on reliable but unverified information, unverified by the country concerned. Relying on social media, relying on what we see from empirical observation, maybe from the WHO office, basically to use a precautionary approach, not to wait until you have a fuller confirmation, which is again what many people have been reproaching WHO of doing back in January, February 2020, of being too cautious, too deferential, too diplomatic, and having waited too long. That's a recurring proposal, including the giving WHO more legal authority to send teams in countries for verification. People talk about inspection. I don't like this term. It's too sort of reminds us of arms control. That's not what we're talking about, but certainly of verifying together with the government what's happening and so on. Obviously, this was a bit of a tactical proposal, and what I'm criticizing China. I'm not so sure that country will want to give carte blanche to WHO to come into their territory if they are next in being the origin of a new outbreak. But I think that the political interest in creating a better WHO in terms of power and political backing is very important and very interesting. The fifth is access to pathogen. We need the pathogens if we want to make diagnostics, vaccine, countermeasures, what we call medical countermeasures, and even understanding what's going on, identifying the pathogen, identifying its properties. It's essential if you want to mount a credible global health defense. It was not so much a problem with COVID because Chinese scientists put the entire genome of the COVID-19 virus on a public database in January, so that in a way did not raise the problem, but the problem is there. And the problem is also the interaction of various bodies of international law. There is by now a grudging consensus that the sharing of pathogens is covered by the international law on biodiversity, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and in particular its Nagoya Protocol on the sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources. And the problem is that the biodiversity regime is very transactional, it's very bilateral, was drafted in the late 80s and early 90s as a response to biopiracy, of basically companies, researchers from developed countries go to low and middle income countries and basically poaching the plants, the animals, the genetic resources. It was not drafted with the sharing of pathogens in mind. Pathogens don't stop in a country. COVID should be a confirmation if we need one. And they need to be shared quickly, multilaterally, and unconditionally. And so one of the tensions here is precisely to adapt the existing regime, or for many people, myself included, I must say, in trying to devise a more dedicated regime that respects the principles of equity that underpin the biodiversity regime, but that respond to the needs of public health, because we constantly have tension. My colleagues in WHO are very concerned that the red tape, bureaucratization, and formalization that the biodiversity regime has introduced is delaying the manufacturing of the seasonal influenza vaccine. And seasonal influenza has been with us for a long time. It doesn't make the headlines, but it kills hundreds of thousands of people every year. And it kills only hundreds of thousands of people because we have a vaccine on the shelf quickly. If the biodiversity regime put hurdles in it, the hundreds of thousands of people can become millions. And so there is a big need to address this point. The sixth argument that you hear a lot is the need for a system to better coordinate or at least harmonize travel and trade restrictions. I don't need to tell you the mess that we've been in since February 2020. We are still in the mess, even in a relatively cohesive space like Western Europe. Different countries are doing different things, and this creates, in my view, sometimes unnecessary barriers to the movement of people, uncertainty, rules that change every week, supply chains have been totally disrupted in a way that nobody would have imagined. So there is a dire need, without sort of illusions or having like harmonized rules worldwide, because there are very legitimate reasons why countries want to decide for themselves, but a better system of somehow introducing an element of coordination or consultation, leading or comparing risk assessment, creating a space where countries can try to decrease these inequalities, decrease these divergences that sometimes don't have much of a public health rationale. So I have 10 points, and a number 7. The number 7 is the big elephant in the room, huge elephant in the room, which is a question of equity. And again, down the line, equitable access to medical resources. This is a universe in its own mind that has been really dominating the public health governance discourse certainly since WTO, since the mid-90s. And why do I say it's a universe in its own right? Because if you look at it holistically, it is about accessing a pathogen, because otherwise you don't get the medicine, research and development, you need to develop the molecule, clinical trials, that's what WHO has coordinated, if you remember, early last year to try to speed up the manufacturing of the vaccine, regulatory approval, manufacturing, allocation, technology transfer, intellectual property. So you see the sheer complexity of this issue. And it's obviously delusional to think that a pandemic treaty can deal with this cycle of innovation. And so it will be, in my view, one of the crucial tests of the political feasibility of a pandemic treaty that it address credibly at least part of this problem. If you follow the political discussion since last year, obviously there is a lot of anger towards the attitude of developed countries, the hoarding of vaccine. Now we are having boosters, while most of sub-Saharan Africa is still waiting for the first shot. But there are also proposals, in particular from the African region, basically saying we don't want to be at the end of the list every single time. We want to manufacture our own vaccines. We want to be, to the largest extent as possible, self-reliant. So we don't need a better system of allocating things that are produced in the north. We want technology transfer. We want a relaxation of intellectual property rules. We want a better system of licensing. We want to be able to have our own regional manufacture. That's in particular a very strong African position. And I'm not sure how you regulate that in the treaty. In this space, things need to happen at many dimensions. In the relation between governments and industry, in the coordination, for example, of research and development, which has been successful. And I think it has created an ethos of openness among scientists that were very happy to work with their colleagues worldwide rather than just within their own countries and so on. But just to say that this is the in my view, in my modest view, the one element that could derail the rest of the negotiation. The 8 is accountability and compliance, again, is being pretty low. And so there is a clear call for a better system of compliance assessment. It doesn't have to be something accusatory and inquisitive. It can be very much based on a peer review, on facilitated models. Here, international law offers many possible models. Environmental law, for example, has been very innovative in terms of how to experiment with this. But there's clearly a consensus that we need a system where there is a higher level of accountability. The IHR does not have an institutionalized system of compliance assessment. That was a major oversight. And as part of the team that participated in the revision, I guess I can take my responsibility. We really didn't think that was necessary. And many states found it very convenient not to raise the issue themselves and not to somehow expose themselves to this kind of scrutiny. And it's something that is not familiar to the public health environment. And so there's also a bit of a narrative gap there. The ninth is again the question of governance. A treaty is seen as a governance tool to bring states back to the center of the action. There is a call for a framework convention that's become like a dogma ever since WHO adopted the framework convention on tobacco control. Every time there is a proposal for a new health treaty, it's always a framework convention. I don't think sometimes people understand why. It's become like an article of faith. As you know, framework convention, this idea of broad conventions that create institutional governance that then develops the law, comes very much from the environmental field, and you'll know very well why. And now it's been transposed to a pandemic treaty. When I have an opportunity to talk about this, including to diplomats, I say, be careful, because you cannot automatically, mechanically transpose something that made sense in the environmental field, where the law was driven by uncertain science, to another field where maybe you don't have the same question of scientific gap that needs to be developed and filled in the course of time. And you risk having a weak convention and then relying on the adoption of protocols or other instruments that may go into stalemate, may be weak themselves, so you risk compounding the weakness. And so I hope that there is some serious reflection, because you may need that kind of framework approach when it comes, for example, to zoonotic risk, that there is a big scientific gap, but not necessarily when it comes to access to countermeasures. There's no science gap there. There is a political gap. And that's why there is a mistrust towards the motives of the Western European countries, to use a framework convention mantra as a device to kick that can down the road. Oh, let's have broad principles and we'll fix the problem in a protocol that may be negotiated many, many years down the line. So also politically, it's a topic on which there is a need for caution. And then finally, the question of financing. It's part and parcel of the debate. A better system of financing that does not follow the typical development, ODA development model, because clearly it's not a conducive model to finance global public good. The production allocation of vaccine, centralizing, for example, the question of research and development, priority setting, and so on. These are global issues that cannot be addressed with a typical development model of financing. There is a need for a different model. And there has been a lot of proposals, a lot of initiatives about this, with the proposal for new funds, or the proposal to vast contribution being managed by the World Bank. The United States is very strong on this. They really want to create what they call an intermediary fund, a fund that funds other funds and that is managed by the World Bank. But clearly financing looms very large, both in the sense of a rationale for a treaty as a more cogent set of rules that will trigger and will manage a higher level of fund, but also, according to some critics, as an argument to try to sideline the treaty. And that's what some people reproach the United States of doing, of proposing this big fund as a way to take some of the wind out of the sails of the treaty proposal. So you see how financing is played tactically sometimes in very different directions. Let me come to the end of my talk. So I hope there's some time for questions. What are some of the pushbacks? I think I already alluded to some of them. The first, again, is don't duplicate and don't sideline the IHR. Overlapping legal instruments is never a good idea. You have confusion, you can have conflicts, you can have the obvious asymmetry coming from a different level of participation. The second is, for the moment, and I'm surprised, not terribly discussed topic, which is when will this treaty apply? Will we only wait for pandemics? Pandemics is too late. What about Ebola? So huge problems that may destabilize entire regions, but they don't have the chance to become pandemics. So the scope of application is something that has not really been carefully discussed. And some people are saying, we need to talk about that. To what will this treaty apply? The third is a fear of fragmentation, adding more layers of rules, more layer of governance, and so on. And it's interesting here, there is a counter argument by the friends of the treaty. They see a treaty as the antidote to fragmentation, as potentially creating a single normative governance roof under which many other governance issues can be placed. And they mentioned the climate change regime that has been a bit of a catalyst for many initiatives. I'm a bit skeptical that a treaty can be that, because a treaty can, even with the best of intentions, be limited to 70, 80 countries for the foreseeable future. And so how's that for the global roof? I'm not so convinced. The third I mentioned is equity. Many countries are basically front-loading that problem. Another one is WHO the right forum? And I explain why. It is a technical agency with a health mandate. It doesn't have necessarily the mandate to talk about patents, to talk about technology transfer, to talk about animal health. And so there are open questions of how far can the constitutional mandate of an international organization go? Is political consensus enough? What will be the reaction of other communities, nationally and internationally? But for the moment, these questions are not really seriously discussed. They are mentioned as a problem to deal with in the future, but the action is very much converging on WHO. And another one is the lack of human rights. It's interesting how human rights have been missing from the conversation. I listen to several informal discussions convened by WHO, and human rights are hardly mentioned. Paid lip service here and there, mentioning the right to health as a basis to claim for better access to medicine, but it's a striking absence of human rights. And there is a main victim of the COVID has been human rights all around the world. So it's interesting to analyze why. And finally, the fact that we need, if you think of this in broad terms, take a step back, you need to look at the whole ecosystem. As I said before, it's not something that the WHO treaty can fix in isolation. Things need to happen in the biodiversity regime, and they're happening in the biodiversity regime. The world is not stopping, waiting for WHO to take action. It has to happen in WTO and in the context of free trade agreements. This agonizing discussion on intellectual property waiver, at least it's a sign that the trade community has engaged, maybe not in the direction that many people would like to, but they'll be discussed at the ministerial conference next week at the highest level. So there is a whole ecosystem of governance that has to be engaged if we think seriously about better preparing the world to prevent and to withstand the shock of a future pandemic. And you need a lot of mature leadership that is prepared to play at different tables, whether it's WTO, environmental conventions, WHO, the United Nations, and so on. And and so that's what I wanted to say to cover some ground on the pandemic treaty. I guess I'll stop here, and I hope there will be questions and comments, and happy to elaborate on things that I just mentioned. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Gianluca, for an absolutely fantastic presentation, so clear as to why this treaty issue came up, the discussions, and I think the arguments for it and the pushbacks. And I think you've just given us foundation for a discussion that could go on for a very long time, actually. But you've laid it out, the picture, the photograph so clearly, and the complexity of it. This is really probably one of the most, if not the most complex challenge that the world has faced and will continue to face. And I think is whether one treaty can solve it, really. But clearly what we have right now is woefully inadequate. We have just seen the system collapse, basically, the international system. So many issues, but I do want to open the floor to questions, and I invite our participants either show yourselves, right? Oh yes, I see, fantastic. And I'm very happy. I believe we have our ambassador from Uganda. Be happy to give you the floor.
Thank you. Let me agree with you, Dr. Orar, that this has been fantastic. And thank you for this presentation, Professor Gian. It is really, it is what I earn for a living for. I've been involved in the environmental, from the Rio Summit, from the UNFCCC convention. I've attended almost 10 COPs, so I know, and I see the comparison. I will ask a couple of questions. Why do you think WHO has really not been seen by member states as the center of action? Is it the personalities of successive DGs that they have not attracted political interest? Because you have to, because it's a skill. You might not have a legal framework, but it's a skill. The UN, I am Uganda's ambassador at the UN, different secretary generals do it differently, and they push the envelope beyond the charter, So if you can talk about the personalities of director generals, the leadership at WHO, basically countries are very disappointed with WHO at the country level, and COVID has exposed that. They just provide ideas that don't work. People have gone to Gavi instead, and to global funds for support, and to civil society. And also quickly, another question is the framework sort of model. I think it would be a good beginning if we can't get consensus on a full-blown treaty. And I was involved also on the Rome Treaty for ICC, where we spent years trying to, where the perfect was the enemy of the good. So, and then we fix it as we go along. And I think, don't underestimate, because look at UNFCCC. Of course, I'm from a developing country. When we see our sovereignty being attacked, we say, oh, the mother treaty is the UNFCCC. We know all that trick, but it didn't prevent Paris. It didn't prevent Glasgow from pushing the envelope with the science. I want you to hear you. I would make a case for the framework sort of kind of approach, but also the big countries. How, you talked about the pushback. I mean, if the US is not a member of the treaty, so what? We can leave them, and those ones who are ready, we continue. So what? I would want you to really talk about that so that we don't delay. I know the EU is reading it, but they have a point. We need a treaty. Everybody thinks we need a treaty, and the developing countries, I think, will get as we get more information, this will work. Thank you. We can go on and go on, but thank you for this. Thank you for this. I learned a lot.
Nilufer, would you like me to respond, or would you like to gather some more questions? You're muted.
I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead, because that was a fairly substantial question.
Yeah, many thanks, Your Excellency. Excellent questions, and it's good that they come from a senior, seasoned diplomat. Well, WHO, as you know, has had a checkered history. It was created with a lot of expectations, and I think we shouldn't be too harsh. International organization cannot be much better than the member states. And when there is a lot also political divisions, we cannot expect sometimes organizations to have somehow transcending those differences. So WHO, I think, has played an important role historically in many aspects. Just the fact of developing common rules in many aspects that have helped develop, for example, a pharmaceutical market, that have helped, that led to the eradication of smallpox, led the almost eradication of poliomyelitis. So some of the achievements of WHO should not be ignored and should not be underestimated. Of course, I fully disclose my bias because I worked 18 years in WHO, and for all its flaws and limits, I think it has a value. It has very dedicated people. You raise correctly sometimes the question of leadership. The tone of the top sometimes makes a difference. For example, in 2003, when we had SARS and there were not yet the revised international health regulation, the Director General was Gro Harlem Brundtland. There was a very sort of bold political figure with a lot of appetite for risk, she did not hesitate to challenge China, to challenge other countries, and her action made a difference. And Dr. Tedros is a very political Director General. He really comes to the job not as a technical person, but very much as a political person. I think he's had a lot of merits, but sometimes he has been dumbfounded member states in the initiatives he's taken. So definitely leadership plays a role in the perception of the organization. You mentioned the United Nations, and we have from Hammarskjöld to Kurt Waldheim, we have all kind of examples of effective or ineffective leadership. I think WHO is, some of the limits are systemic. It's a technical agency. It's been always the preserver of ministries of health. Health has become bigger than public health. It's become very political. It touches on everything, from human rights to environment to security and so on. This one, to me, is the almost existential challenges of an organization like WHO, that is seen as fundamentally normative, technical organization that thinks it can perform best when it stays in its public health box. And obviously it talks to the same community in countries and so on, but it's acting in a very and increasingly political and politicized environment. And that's why, as you correctly said, some of the action has moved elsewhere. When it comes to financing, has moved to the World Bank, has moved to the Global Fund, has moved to Gavi on immunization, because they could do things in a more agile way, in a way that WHO could not do because of the expectation, of the structure, of the interest revolving around it, and so on. So again, I would give I wouldn't say it's a failure. It has challenges, and probably it has to find its own way in a very competitive field. Global health has become very competitive and very fragmented. And let's hope that COVID leads also to a better sense from the membership of what WHO role is. But to me, it's encouraging that nobody's talking about sidelining WHO, creating a new organization on pandemics. No, I think correctly, it is still seen as an indispensable organization. On the Framework Convention, I'm not sort of throwing away the baby with the bathwater. And as I said, in the environmental field, for biodiversity, for climate change, for air pollution, for the protection of the ozone layer, it made a lot of sense, because the problem was the lack of scientific certainty and the lack of consensus on the science. So you needed this kind of open model that would allow Paris, would allow the Glasgow, would allow the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, would allow this development of policy science interface. What I'm concerned about is that this is mechanically moved to topics where you don't need this model. You need a clearer engagement now. And if you have a broader convention, because, as you said, the best is the enemy of the good, so be it. But call it that way. It's a broad convention that can develop, for example, through guidelines, through other instruments, but don't lock in a model that works because you negotiate subsequent protocols and so on. Because protocols are separate treaties with all the political problems, the inertia, the transaction cost of negotiating a new treaty. And the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control is a good example. Again, I was part of the team that assisted the negotiation. And during the negotiation, people were dreaming about 8, 10, 12 protocols in a few years. After almost 20 years, we have one protocol on illicit trade on tobacco products that seemed the proverbial low-hanging fruit, who is in favor of tobacco smuggling. And it took 4 painful years to negotiate. It's all over the place if you read it. It took 6 years to enter into force. And it has, I think, 62, 63 parties, which is not that bad, but it's a third of the parties to the Framework Convention. That, to me, is a kind of lessons that should at least lead states to take a step back and see what is the best model, not just knee-jerk adoption of a model that belong to more cogently to a different set of issues. That was my point.
Thank you. And I think you made a very good argument why the Framework Convention really may not work in this case. And frankly, we know that states really don't want to have new treaties and new protocols. So whatever can happen now would be the best opportunity, perhaps. But that's something to talk about and think about more. All right, I'm going to go on to our next question, and this is from Singapore. We have Joel.
Thank you, Professor Burci. Just a small question. Just now you were mentioning that the scope of the new pandemic treaty, it's rather uncertain and will be kind of related or just constrained to the idea of pandemic. So, and it might be too late to wait in terms of waiting for a pandemic to occur, because as you mentioned, things like Ebola and those sorts of things don't amount to a pandemic. So I just wanted to ask how the PHEIC framework in the IHR, whether it's not going to be used in this new pandemic treaty, and it will be sidelined for, it will only be invoked when there's a pandemic and when it occurs in that very narrow scope of situations.
Would you like me to respond, Nilufer? Would you like to gather more questions?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, excellent question. As I said, for the moment, there's not a big, at least as far as I can see, overt discussion on the scope. Everybody calls it a pandemic treaty on pandemic preparedness and response. The preparedness and the prevention obviously should prevent anything from becoming a pandemic. So that I think is a value in its own right. As you correctly said, there is a question of relationship with international health regulation. There is this alert system based on a public health emergency of international concern. That has been an approach that has gathered some criticism in its own right, because COVID has been defined as a fake, as we use the acronym, but also Zika, that has more or less affected a few countries in Latin America, or Ebola, that has been contained in West Africa. So it's been used in very diverse way that people say, what is the logic behind that? And shouldn't there be a better system of alert, that it doesn't necessarily depend on declaring an emergency, and below the emergency there is nothing formalized. So I agree that there is a need for a better system of international alert, not so binary, more gradual. I think we should treat countries like grown-ups that are able to respond to a graduated system of alerts that can be developed along different indicators. And I personally think that a treaty should not have a system of alert, because imagine we have a treaty with its own alert system and 80 parties. And at the same time, with the IHR, they keep their own fake system, 196 parties. How do the two relate together? To me, it's extremely confusing. I personally think that if there is, if we need a system of global alert, that should be kept within the IHR, which for all the limits are a global instrument, 196 parties. And the treaty should be complementary to that, should deal with other issues. But the question of scope remains open. Some people, for example, I saw some academic articles saying almost like a two-speed approach. When something is not a pandemic, you apply the IHR. When something becomes a pandemic, you apply the treaty. It doesn't make any sense. You don't switch on and off international law like this. Again, sorry not to be more conclusive, but it's a rather confusing discussion that I hope will clarify in the next few months.
Thank you for that question. And we have another question from Ankit from India.
Well, let me just thank you. I completely agree with the very obvious point which you made, that the pandemic treaty and calling it the pandemic treaty is fine, but the action must not start once it's become a pandemic, because it's very late by then. It's quite simple: test, trace, test, treat. That's how straightforward it is. But I just want to highlight two fallacies in states and also the WHO itself. You spoke about states being mature, but it's been rather opposite of that. I mean, India in itself, with the United Kingdom, got into a difficult diplomatic row because the vaccines which are distributed in India were not admitted. So lot of back and forth happened, and then eventually things worked out. But that seems like a very long shot from states adopting a mature level. It's also highlighted the TRIPS agreements and how countries like India and also South Africa are really pushing hard for a waiver on these TRIPS agreements, but that's not coming. So then someone like a Professor B.S. Chimney, who spoke about this earlier as well to me, he said that this represents some sort of a colonial perspective. Of course, that sort of dominated by his understanding and perception, but the point he was trying to make is that there is no sort of consensus, there is no maturity among states, and even in these exceptional circumstances, there's not much budging which is actually taking place. The other point which I wanted to raise after this I'm close is with respect to the WHO. Now, I was doing a bit of research and I found that the WHO conducted a research on economy class syndrome. It's essentially a study conducted to study the impacts. I echoed the same sentiment as you expressed just now. It's basically a study to study the tendency of cramped air travelers to develop blood clots in their legs, and there's $1 million research which is conducted on this. Why I'm mentioning this is to suggest that perhaps WHO has been responsible for its own demise sort of being used here slightly loosely, but I mean,
do you have a question, Ankit?
My question really is that studies such as those responsible for its downfall, in the sense of it not being taken as seriously as it perhaps should be?
Well, first of all, Dr. Malhotra, I acknowledge you sent me an email and I owe you a reply, so it will come. Apologies. Well, WHO, international organizations are not academic institutions, are not pure. And WHO, when it moved out of its typical infectious disease box, it bumps into huge economic interest. The study you mentioned is one, but think all the huge agenda of non-communicable diseases that are largely brought by tobacco, by alcohol, by food, by beverages, by sedentary lifestyle, also led by the automotive industry and so on. So there are huge economic interests behind. WHO obviously wants to keep its credibility, and I must say that while I was there, the system of producing knowledge, of producing guidelines, of producing scientific findings has improved a lot in terms of management of conflict of interest, in terms of trying to avoid the funding raising these kind of issues and so on. You can always point out to particular incidents or particular instances where this is not realized, where there have been concerns about the intrusion of economic interest. You remember during the H1N1 influenza pandemic, we were criticized a lot for having hyping a non-existent pandemic and basically fatten the pockets of the pharmaceutical industry. I was there, I don't think it was the case, but the perceptions are hard to shake. So I don't have a general answer. I think that an organization like WHO, for all its various heads, remains at core a normative organization producing soft law on public health. And soft law doesn't sell itself because it's binding and enforceable. Sell itself because it's perceived as authoritative, as legitimate, as responding to needs, as inclusive of all related interests. And so I think it's in the existential interest of WHO to try to maintain its credibility as a normative organization. If the incident you said becomes like a widespread perception that whatever WHO does is just wishy-washy, or it's just the industry regulating itself by proxy, it's the end of the organization. So you can have incidents, but again, I declare my bias. I think that by and large, WHO tries to do a good work within the limits of its resources, of its possibilities, and so on. Again, we can question also during COVID, we've been criticized for being too tentative on the use of masks, on the spread of COVID, and so on and so forth. There are many reasons for that, and the media immediately jump on it and sometimes distort the whole thing. But again, don't generalize. Look at things more critically and try to understand why certain things are developed the way they are. So there can be many factors. And I guess we come to the end of
yes. Regrettably, actually, because I think we could go on talking about this. So I'm hoping that we can have another occasion to do this, particularly, as you know, IOLET is leading our global health law and policy program here at the center because we give this issue great priority. And I think that you have laid out so many of the complexities. And I have to agree, I think it's unfair to blame WHO. I think the point you made that it's really the states. It's easy to blame one organization which has been given very limited power, and ultimately it's the states who are failing. So let's see if they can live up to the challenge. And this treaty is another test case for that. So we will be following this very closely. And Patricia knows that in the International Law Commission, we have been discussing this as well, because it's a huge issue. And I would love to go into more of the questions about, you talked about the ecosystems. I mean, is it just WHO? There are so many other parts of this. And we have this siloed system in the UN system. How do we go beyond that? But we don't have time. So
next time.
So this will be the next time. So please join me, everyone, in thanking Professor Gianluca Burci for an absolutely fantastic and such an insightful, and it's a view that we will not get so easily from everyone. So a big round of applause. And
applause.
Chrissy, did you want to say anything?
No, I just fully subscribe what you've said, Nilofer, and also what our participants truly felt that this was a unique opportunity to have insight about real negotiations on this very, very important topic for all of us, not just for states, but all of us as citizens that have been going through a unique experience in our lives that we never thought we would go through, for sure. And the timing, the fact that this meeting is going to take place next week, and all the inside information that you shared with us. Of course, as Nilofer said, I think this really needs a follow-up after next week when we know the next step. So Gianluca, thanks again on behalf of the Academy and of all the participants.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me, and definitely it's a work in progress, so there will be more opportunities for discussion.
Wonderful. We welcome that. Very well. Well, take care, everyone. As we say now, be safe.
Be safe.
Be safe.
All the best.
Until the next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.